1. Tandy. Class Failed Archer. Level 35. HP 720 out of 720. Status Debug Mode. XP 1,355,135. Next level 1,500,000. The water dragon was a sinuous creature, 30 feet of smooth yellow skin speckled with brilliant red. Tandy found her in a wide green lagoon in one of the many sea caves off the coast of Fire. The dragon was sleeping half submerged, curled around a clutch of eggs mottled gray and black like river stones. "Aloha, pretty thing," Tandy murmured. "Sorry I can't just let you nap today." It was a shame to kill her, as gorgeous as she was. But sometimes you had to do what you had to do. The dragon had a full health bar at 4,200 hit points. Tandy used her greater insight skill to check the dragon's resistances. Weak to cold, strong to water, strong to fire. So far, so good. Tandy pulled up her inventory display, looking for just the right cold attack. Ice arrows? No. She wanted to get this done faster to make for a clearer test. Tandy needed to pull out the big guns for this. Enhanced ice arrows it was. The dragon stirred in her sleep, laying her webbed digits on one of her eggs protectively. Tandy felt a twinge of guilt. Hopefully she'd only have to do this one last time.
Realm presents Ctrl-Alt-Destroy. Episode 1.
Tandy shot an enhanced ice arrow toward the shallow pool in which the dragon rested. The arrow left a glittering trail in its path, resolving into snowflakes that drifted in the air for a few seconds and then vanished. When the arrow struck the water, the surface glazed over and turned to ice. The dragon began to take damage, 100 HP a second, ticking down and down. She reared up on her hind legs and thrashed, shattering the layer of ice that held her in place. The dragon spread her shimmering jaws wide and roared. "That's it," Tandy said encouragingly. "Go on. You know you're mad. Now do something about it." The dragon glowered at Tandy, twin trickles of steam rising from her nostrils. But she didn't attack. "I'm right here," Tandy said. She waved, but all the dragon did was watch her, head bobbing nervously. Tandy pulled up a console window and skimmed through the log rapidly, unspooling there. She frowned. The dragon was definitely aware of her, and flagged her as an enemy too. That was an improvement. The last time Tandy had used an indirect environmental attack, the dragon had never realized that she was an enemy. But Tandy had patched that yesterday, and obviously that part worked. So why wasn't she attacking now? The dragon's health was still ebbing away. The ice was gone, but the magical bubble of cold that the enhanced ice arrow had created was still there. She was down to half health, down to 1/3. Tandy paused the world. The dragon stilled, and so did everything else. The curling steam from her nostrils, the motion of the water, the ripples of refracted light across the cave ceiling. She scrolled back through the last minute or two of action, trying to pinpoint the problem. The dragon wasn't doing the right thing. But what was she doing instead? And then Tandy found it. The dragon had gone aggro on a target, and the target was the layer of ice on the water. Once she destroyed the ice, she hadn't been able to re-target the source of the original attack, Tandy and her arrow, because she was still taking damage from the ice that didn't exist anymore and couldn't be attacked. Right, Tandy grimaced. There were some easy ways to patch this, but she'd have to think about which one to use. As complicated as Alternus was, even a small change in targeting behavior could wreck the game's balance. Alternus was her life's work, her masterpiece, her hobby, and her reason for living. For almost 10 years, she'd been building the MMO she wished she could play, a sprawling, beautiful virtual world where magic was real and evil could be fought. It was her secret sanctuary, and her hope of one day building a better life for herself. Except, she pulled up the time. 8:17 a.m. If she didn't hustle, she'd be late for work. She put her system to sleep to save on her utilities rations and then pulled off her VR headset and gloves. She tossed them in an untidy heap on her desk, grabbed her retro Zelda Triforce messenger bag, and ran out the door to catch the bus. Alternus could wait a little longer. She had as much time as she needed to get everything right. Tandy made it to work 8 minutes late, ducking past Casper's cube in the hope her manager wouldn't notice she'd snuck in and would just assume she'd been there the whole time. She threw her bag under her desk, and while she waited for her workstation to boot, she used her phone to check her personal email. Just one last time before resigning herself to 8 hours of being cut off from everything she cared about. That was when she found the email that would change everything. She sent it to herself. Or rather, she'd written the automated process that had generated the email. The game only sent notifications when it ran into a problem Tandy needed to know about. Problems weren't exactly rare. The rolling blackouts of the last few years meant a lot of unexpected server shutdowns for one thing, even here in San Francisco. There was also something wrong with her server's memory, but she didn't have the money to replace the hardware. So it just freaked out once in a while. And there'd been a mild but persistent problem with her data connection over the last year that kept reporting weird resource overflows she couldn't track down to save her life. Well, that was why the game was still a secret. Not yet ready for prime time. It could wait until it was perfect. This morning's email was a completely new problem. It said that Alternus was coming close to Tandy's data limit for the month. 5 days in. She ostensibly had enough capacity to handle 20 concurrent players all month long. Overkill, yes, but it was the cheapest package she could find that gave her everything she needed. But she didn't actually have any players, not counting herself, so there was simply no way that usage was accurate. Her supervisor stalked around the corner. He was a sour-faced white man with a body like a coat hanger bent out of shape. He wielded resentment the way an orc wielded a battle axe, always looking for an excuse to cut his staff down. His eyes fell on her. With her phone in her hands, he crossed his arms. Miss Kahana Nui? Hard at work, I see. She dropped the phone onto her desk as if it had turned into a venomous snake. I just got a notification, she said. So I was turning the volume off so it wouldn't bother anybody. Sorry. The supervisor thrust his lower lip toward her, but thankfully didn't pursue the issue any further. Instead, he paced the row of cubicles looking for another victim. He found some poor sucker 4 cubes down who wasn't wearing his security badge. Tandy opened a dozen windows on her work desktop, trying to make it at least look like she was focusing on the pivotal legacy server migration. But once the supervisor stepped out of the office for what Tandy thought of as a post-coital espresso, she felt safe to investigate the email a little further. She surreptitiously pulled up the dashboard for her game server on her phone. The email wasn't in error after all. According to her own analytics, she really had blown through most of her data for the month. She flipped down to the previous month for comparison and discovered a sudden, exponential increase in activity starting about 2 weeks before. That was odd. She was going to have to spend more time looking into it, just not here. She looked around and bit her lip, hoping nobody had noticed she'd spent a little too long on a personal device. The lights stuttered and went out. The otherwise imperceptible hum of equipment faded away. A surprised shout came from the far side of the floor, probably someone who'd had the bad luck to be walking or pouring coffee when the power died. There was a tense silence as everyone waited in the darkness to see if the power would come back on, or if the official word would come down that the company's power ration had been exceeded and that they'd all get to go home. Stay in your seats, the supervisor shouted. The backup is coming online. A moment later, the lights blinked on again. A sigh of mingled relief and disappointment came from nowhere and everywhere. And the Data Interoperability Department of Industrial Informatics went back to work. Tandy left as early as she thought she could get away with. 6:42. A graceful period after all the bosses had gone home, but well before the system automatically locked her out so Industrial Informatics wouldn't have to pay her overtime. An unusual flash of neon green caught her attention from the convenience store just off the lobby. The refrigerator case was stocked with Hydrokinetic, the Canadian energy drink she'd been hooked on in college. It had been impossible to find over the last few years, international relations being what they were. She felt a giddy burst of optimism. The return of Hydrokinetic was another sign that things were getting better, the way the talking heads kept saying. She bought one for the road and savored the zingy sweetness as she waited for her bus at the end of the block. It really was her night. The bus came exactly when the sign said it would, after only 3 minutes, and she even got a whole row to herself. The news blared from the screen over her head as the bus made its bumblebee rounds. Cleanup efforts at Lake Baikal were lagging behind schedule as crews had to defend against feral packs of warbots. Some Indian manufacturing company was thinking of setting up facilities in El Paso and Baltimore. A famous pro gamer hadn't updated his stream in a few weeks, and there were rumors he had lupus or cancer, or he was transitioning. Russia and China were on the brink of signing a formal border de-escalation treaty. That last one startled Tandy so much that she almost dropped her precious drink. The ridership of the bus looked at one another wide-eyed, confirming that all of them had heard the same thing. For years, it had seemed like the world was creeping inexorably towards global war, and that the end of things was going to come in her lifetime. Every step towards peace had been met with 2 steps backward as regimes changed, interests shifted, treaties were negotiated in bad faith. Cities had started building bomb shelters. Nations around the world had stepped up civil defense plans and begun holding drills. Hot rhetoric became tactical strikes, became months-long border skirmishes. But maybe it didn't have to be like that. If Russia and China could ease the tension between them, even after the hot war over all that fresh water in Lake Baikal, then anything at all could happen. Maybe things really were going to be okay. She sank into an optimistic daydream, the most familiar and indulgent of all. She could finish her game probably in another year or 2, or maybe 3, so she could get everything just right. She'd release it into the world. Players would discover all of its hidden delights and be completely obsessed. It would be a huge sensation, and she'd finally be able to quit her job, start a video game studio, and work on Alternus full-time. She knew it was a thin hope, wispy and prone to evaporate under the harsh light of reality. But some days, that hope was the only thing that kept her going through the motions. Tandy had been hoarding her power ration all week for a binge coding and testing session on the weekend. But now she had an urgent mystery to solve. She powered on her home game rig again for its lengthy warm-up cycle while she prepped a bowl of quick noodles and slurped them down. With her free hand, she confirmed once again that the email wasn't a mistake. At least it should be child's play to figure out where the data was going. The hardest part was remembering where the game's access logs were stored. Since it was only her playing, she didn't have much call to look at them. Now she scanned them for clues. At first, line after line was the same. Her home IP address, recorded during her usual hours after work and on weekends, but then it changed about a year ago. An unfamiliar IP address popped up once in a month, then once in a week, then several times a day, until things went totally off the rails 2 weeks ago. Something was very definitely drawing from her game's assets. She hadn't been logging enough information to tell exactly what they were taking from her server, so she didn't know if they were after graphics or using her attack algorithm's AI or what. Or, more likely, maybe she was hosting a malware engine and didn't know it. There was one way to find out more. The log told her where the data was going, if not who it was or why anyone would bother her in the first place. Tandy tried to connect to the mystery IP. She expected to see a login prompt, but instead the screen said VR output only, change output destination? Curious. Might as well. She settled the VR set over her head and clicked yes. She felt a moment of nausea as her brain struggled to match up what she was seeing and hearing with what she was feeling. Her senses settled their disagreements with one another, resulting in a stable landscape. A very familiar landscape. She was perched on a cliff overlooking verdant hills and a fluffy expanse of forest. The ocean shimmered to the left, and to the right, a foreboding castle in the shape of a skull squatted on a mountainside. A swell of inspiring orchestral music rose up all around her, punctuated by the distant cry of seabirds. Her nausea returned, though for a different reason now. She wasn't just looking at some other game that was pulling an asset or two from hers. It was Alternus. Someone had stolen her whole world. Tandy, class not applicable. Level 1. HP, 32 out of 32. Status, tutorial. XP, 0. Next level, 1000. Tandy didn't have long to wallow in shock and self-pity before she was interrupted.
"Welcome to Alternus, hero,"
intoned a breathy female voice.
"We have been waiting for thee."
Tandy jumped. The voice was unfamiliar. She didn't have the budget for any voices in her game, so the thieves were obviously making enhancements. But she'd written those words herself. She sighed. "Hi, Zen." She turned to face the character who had appeared at her elbow. Zen the Seer, her game's guide and primary quest giver, was an elfin figure with a tall staff topped by a crystal ball. Her skin had the sheen and color of polished cedar, and her eyes were improbably large and impossibly crimson. Under her hooded robe, she wore knee-high boots and a sheer, fluttering garment with 2 deep leg slits rising up to her hips. Tandy cringed inwardly at the sight of her. Zen was one of the first game elements she designed, and she felt she'd come a long way since then. She'd kept meaning to come back and change Zen into something a little less, well, less sexist and trite. But it was only one thing in the endless stack of things that needed improving. The particle effects on a fireball needed to smoke more convincingly. Pole arms needed to be a little more balanced against swords and axes. The AI that regulated non-players' characters' daily lives needed to be smarter about mood and context so that a player couldn't rouse a shopkeeper from bed in their home and immediately buy a dozen portions.
"Destiny awaits,"
Zen continued speaking.
"But first, thou must make some choices. Choose wisely, hero, for what thou shalt decide here on this day can never be undone."
The character selection screen popped up, obscuring Tandy's view of the scenery. It was her interface design, glowing letters against a black backdrop, with stylized figures around the border as an accent. It looked sharp, if she did say so herself. But it wasn't entirely hers. To begin with, the settings to change your appearance were missing, and there was no species selection at all. She felt a sting of annoyance that her game thief didn't see the value in playing as any kind of troll or water spirit. So whatever this was, it wasn't a straight duplicate of her Alternus. Someone had taken her game and used it as a foundation for something else. Who could it be? And why in the wide world would they be interested in an amateur's unfinished game? The IP address she'd accessed to get here hadn't been informative, just numbers that didn't resolve into a human-readable address and didn't tie into a geo-block. That was a clue all on its own, though, now that she thought about it, because it meant that whoever had stolen her game wasn't doing anything public with it. There was another layer of mystery here, too. Who could have possibly had access to her files in the first place? She stretched her hands so they wouldn't cramp under the weight of her haptic gloves as she tried to puzzle it through. She'd never shown anyone her work. She lurked in plenty of games and game design communities, but never posted in them. She hadn't shown any of her fellow cubicle drones at work, and certainly not any of the handful of first and second dates she'd had over the last few years. She really didn't have anyone else in her life to share it with. What about strangers? Hackers and scammers? Tandy didn't exactly have the best security in the world. Security through obscurity, it was called. Relying mostly on the fact that nobody knew that the game existed, much less where to access it. But it should have been good enough. But there was a more likely lead. Maybe some random crawler or piece of malware had accessed her game and shared files with someone. Even that didn't make any sense, though. It's not like she was sitting on top of a stack of credit card numbers. Why would anyone want an unfinished and never released game they'd never heard of? Even more unlikely, who would want to build a whole new game on top of it once they'd stolen it? Maybe if she played for a while, she'd pick up some clues. It was really the only lead she had. Tandy flipped her way through the character creation tabs and options. There were both more and less than she expected. There was a profusion of character classes, many more than she'd ever created, and some of them didn't make any sense at all. Of course, there were the classics: straight mage, paladin, thief, healer, assassin, barbarian. Some of those she was most proud of were missing. The Valkyrie, the Flame Walker, the Wave Rider. But there were dozens that she'd never seen before. A lot of them made no sense at all. What the hell was an Arc Thief? Or a Raspberry Mage? Who in the world would want to be a camel binder? She scrolled through. She only needed something to get her through the first few hours of play, so categories that were weak in the early game, like mages, were out. She chose the Veiled Archer, her favorite hybrid class these days, since it allowed her to deal moderate damage from a safe distance, and she could eventually pick up a few sneaky thieves skills too. Next screen. The stats system was exactly the same as her Alternus. She had 10 points to assign across 5 basic statistics: agility, strength, endurance, spirit, and concentration. She'd always felt that some of the classic stats like charisma and intelligence were a little weird, because she couldn't keep a smart player from making smart decisions, and you couldn't keep a charmer from making friends no matter how off-putting their character was supposed to be. Since this was her game, she could leave them out, and did. Every statistic started at 8, mediocre, on top of the 10 extra points she had to assign. She could lower one of the default stats to boost something even higher, but that would create crippling vulnerabilities in the early game: an inadequate inventory capacity or extreme susceptibility to diseases and poisons, or a non-existent defense against magical attacks. Any short-term advantage in attack or spell-casting power wasn't worth the price. If she was going with an archer-style build, then her stat distribution was obvious. She put 3 points into agility and 2 points into strength and concentration. Agility and strength would both help her attack power. The formula for bow attacks used agility to calculate accuracy and strength to calculate how much damage she did. The extra concentration points, though, unlocked one of her favorite skills: perception. The ability to notice what others' eyes might miss, secret doors, hidden enemies, and more. Requires a concentration of 10 or higher. For her other skill points, she waffled between the self-explanatory quick shot and herb knowledge, which would let her boost healing speed with a little time spent foraging. So she opened the tab with the skill tree to take a look at what other options there were. Most of it was locked, grayed out so that a player couldn't plan what skills to buy 9 steps in advance. Even among the first-tier skills, there were many more options here than in her Alternus, some of them as ridiculous seeming as the Raspberry Mage had been. Honey Whisperer. The ability to calm a swarm of enraged bees, plus 30% chance of a double honey drop. Wilderness Nudist. Regenerate hit points at a rate of 10 HP per minute in non-inhabited locations, provided no armor or clothing is equipped. She wasn't sure whether to be smug about being a better game designer or angry that someone had taken her carefully thought-out game and done this to it. A child could do a better job. It was like they'd been generated by one of those machine learning toys that had been in fashion back when she was a kid. The ones that came up with hilariously close but wrong lists of Halloween costumes and recipes. Well, whatever. If it became important, she could go back to this screen later. For now, she just needed to do some exploring and see what she could find out, and she didn't think her game thief would have left their name lying around in a skill description. She closed the character creator and moved on with the tutorial.
Well done, hero, Zen said.
She swept an arm to encompass every part of the vista before them. The sea, the forest, the mountains.
Behold the kingdom of Alternus. This is a magical land of adventure and fable, but there is a darkness here as well. Thou must knoweth, we suffer under the curse of—
Skip, Tandy said. She knew all the backstory already. Skull King imprisoned for 1,000 years, risen again seeking vengeance, blah blah. It was a great story, and she was very proud of herself for all of its twists and turns. But the whole intro speech was a little long, and Tandy needed to conserve her power ration. Zin stopped her spiel midstream, and Tandy must have been imagining things because she could have sworn that for just a moment Zin's computer-generated face had actually pouted. An alert popped up at the edge of Tandy's field of view. New quest available. She pulled down the banner. This was verbatim her tutorial quest. Poke's pesky prowlers. Adventurer, prepare to begin your journey to greatness. Farmer Poke is having a little trouble with crows eating his crops. Find him and help him solve his problem. Reward, 10 silver, rustic knapsack, 800 XP. Accept this quest? Tandy took a deep breath. Now she was emerging from the first giddy flush of outrage. She wasn't quite sure whether she was doing the right thing. What was her endgame here? Legal action? Just asking the game thief to quit and apologize? Some sort of profit share or credit? Getting ahead of yourself, Tandy. She couldn't take any action, legal or otherwise, until she'd identified the culprit. Her best bet would be to find someone who knew what was going on and get them to tell her. But if this game was as much like hers as it seemed, then players were going to be awful thin on the ground. Worse than finding a needle in a haystack, like finding a speck of dust on a beach. Well, she had to start somewhere. She flipped the quest book to the side and pulled up the game's main interface looking for a map. Maybe it would pinpoint the locations of other players if there were any. Instead, she found chaos, where her game had a clean and elegantly designed user interface. If she did say so herself. This was a profusion of tabs, slide-out drawers, sidebars, and floating pans with no apparent organizing principle behind them. She shuffled through them, but couldn't find a map to save her life, which was going to put a real damper on her search for other players. She'd have to come up with another plan. Luckily, the problem solved itself.
Who the hell are you supposed to be?
Someone asked. Tandy whirled around. There was a young man in dented steel armor standing a few yards away. Everything about him looked familiar, from the white-tipped spikes of his hair to the crooked set of his jaw. And the name floating in pale blue over his head told her why. Dante. That was the pro gamer who had gone missing. What in the actual... No. Far more likely it was just some fan of his who designed an avatar to look like him. At any rate, he was a real human player, which meant he would have answers for her. Three. The ersatz Dante squinted at her.
What team are you on? India?
The animation was so smooth, the lip sync so perfect, that at first she didn't even process what he'd actually said. Finally, team?
Don't try to convince me you're an NPC. This game is shitty, but it isn't so shitty that NPCs are tagged in the same color as real players.
Tandy's heart dropped. He might as well have pushed her out of a plane in mid-air. This was the first human being who had ever experienced her game that she knew of anyway, and he thought it was shitty? Her eyelids prickled. And wait, that was the real Dante's voice and speaking cadence. Or a perfect impersonation. It couldn't really be him, could it? The Dante? The real Dante? And he hated Alternus. She tried to remember everything she knew about the pro gaming star. He was a 3-time international VR games champion. He was from San Juan. He had about 9 million subscribers and sponsorships with some energy drink, she couldn't remember which one, and a bunch of companies that made high-end custom game rigs, tweaked performance monitors, that kind of thing. Dante, real or imposter, stared fixedly at the spot above her head, presumably where her character information was displaying for him.
How do you hide your faction, though? Is there a buff you found somewhere? Scroll?
Devastating insult or not, Tandy had to keep it together if she wanted to find out what was going on here. She cleared her throat. At level 1? Tandy shook her head. No scrolls, no buffs.
You're still level 1 after 2 weeks?
He raised an eyebrow.
Well, that does explain why you haven't ditched cosplay Barbie over here yet.
He nodded at Zen the Seer, who returned surprisingly good side-eye at the insult. 2 weeks? That matched up with the sharp uptick in the draw from her server. You've been here that long?
Of course, just like everyone else. What happened that you had to get swapped in so late?
She struggled to think up an answer that wouldn't raise his suspicions. He brightened and bounced on his heels like the real Dante did in videos when he'd struck on a brilliant new strategy. No, it couldn't be the real him. That would just be bizarre.
Did you even find your starter gear yet?
He asked. I haven't been here long enough to find anything, Tandy said. I seriously just got here. I haven't even finished the tutorial yet. She turned back to Zen the Seer to make a show of continuing to play the game. Zen, where should I go next? Zen waved an arm dramatically. Farmer Poke is having a little trouble with crows eating his crops. Please, hero, find him and help him solve his problem. The Poke's Pesky Prowler's quest box popped up in front of Tandy again.
Do it,
Dante said.
Come on, it'll take like 15 minutes. I'll help.
Why would you help me?
There's a 500 XP bonus for... Well, you'll see. Anyway, I get something out of it. Relax.
His lips twitched. That couldn't be just animation. Maybe he had one of those super realistic VR rigs. The ones that pointed sensors at your face so they could map your tune to your real face in real time. That was an expensive piece of gear. Maybe he was the Dante after all. Well, spending a little more time with him might give her a way to ease into asking what the deviled eggs was going on here. And maybe get some constructive feedback she could use to improve the original Alternus. Tandy jabbed at the accept this quest button. Congratulations, adventurer, squealed Zen. Now make your way to Farmer Poke's humble fields. Thou canst find them over yon hillside on the other side of the river. I shall meet thee there and help thee continue thy journey. She raised her staff and vanished in a swirl of triumphant lavender smoke.
Let's go.
Dante started walking down the hill. A winding path took them toward a quaint stone bridge. The farmer's fields were visible on the other side. Tandy cleared her throat. If she wanted answers to the hard questions, she was going to have to work up the nerve to actually ask them. So are you really the real...
Hold up.
Dante darted toward a spot in the grass and snatched something off the ground. He held it up triumphantly.
Red-winged grasshopper! I haven't even seen that one yet. Into inventory with you, little guy.
He gestured and the grasshopper vanished. Tandy's impulse to ask the hard questions got derailed again. Why did you...
Not telling. You're the competition, aren't you?
Competition. It was sounding like Tandy's game had been swiped for some kind of private tournament? But that was ridiculous.
What's wrong with your connection anyway? He frowned at her. You seem a little choppy, like your motion cap isn't working right.
Tandy hesitated. Of course, the problem was that she didn't have any motion capture equipment at all. She could play her whole hand right now and tell him how she'd found this game. Maybe she'd even get his support in asking him everything he knew about it. But there was a funny feeling in her gut that that would go badly. Technical problems, she said.
Oh, that sucks, he said. I'm sure your people will have you running high test again in no time, though.
So how did you get here? She blurted. She tried not to look at him too obviously, no matter how much she wanted to scrutinize his beautifully rendered micro-expressions. He laughed.
You know I can't tell you,
he said.
It was an intense selection process, just like the one I bet my sister's favorite plush dolphin that you went through for your team.
Tandy puzzled that over as they walked. Intense selection process? To play her game? And why would all of that be a big secret? She'd heard about non-disclosure agreements that would explain secrecy during beta testing, but not to the extent of hiding basic facts from other people involved in the same thing as you. She was spared having to come up with another angle of attack, another way to ask, so what's going on here anyway? Without actually asking it, when they arrived at Farmer Polk's farm. It was a quaint thing. A square farmhouse made of sandstone with a thickly thatched roof set against a checked backdrop of green and gold fields. The farmer waited by the door, alternately looking at the sky and at them. He was a blobby gnome with a chin-strap beard, like someone had fashioned an Abraham Lincoln out of orange Play-Doh and then squashed it down. As soon as they walked through the open gate, the farmer rushed towards them. "Adventurers, perhaps you can..." "Skip," Dante said. The farmer stopped short and stood in place, smiling stupidly. "Hey, he was explaining the quest," protested Tandy. It was one thing for her to skip over the things she'd seen a million times to conserve her power ration, but for someone else to ignore her lovingly crafted story was heartbreaking. As if summoned by the thought, the VR world around her flickered. Power blip. Tandy prayed that it would hold for just a little while longer.
The script is stupid. I saved you from rolling your eyes too much and spraining them,
Dante said. Stupid? He thought the script was stupid? Tandy wasn't going to cry. She wouldn't cry. His opinion wasn't everything. 9 million subscribers or not. He didn't even tell me what to do yet, she pleaded.
Easy. Go out back, kill the crows. Are you ready or what?
Dante drew his sword. It appeared like he'd pulled it from a pocket in thin air, and it was ridiculously oversized, as tall as he was, though he held it as delicately as if it were made of balsa wood. I don't have a weapon, Tandy said. He tensed.
Oh shit! The farmer was supposed to give you...
Tandy addressed Farmer Poke. How can I help you? She asked. Poke began his speech over again. Adventurers! He took off his hat and held it in both hands. My crops are going to be ruined if you don't help. I'm plagued by murderous crows. Won't you see if you can shoo them away for good? A new alert popped up. New item acquired. Rustic bow. This simple bow is rough but lovingly crafted from durable materials. Cannot be used with incendiary or magic ammo types. The bow appeared in Tandy's hands.
Great,
Dante said.
Now come on.
He trotted toward the back corner of the fields, and Tandy followed. She stopped short, though, when she saw the first crow. The bird was easily the size of a German shepherd. Its feathers were glossy and black as pitch, realistically rendered in far more detail than the cartoonish crows she had created. This was her Alternus, and yet it wasn't. Tandy shifted in her seat and tightened the glove straps around her wrists so they wouldn't slip during combat. The crow spread its wings and hissed at her as she raised her bow. Its tongue was long and acid yellow. She definitely hadn't coded that either. She heard the beat of wings around her, more crows coming from other fields to help chase the players off. The first took wing and struck at her with its claws. The haptics on her VR rig were terrible, thank God, so she only felt a buzz in her fingers. She only had 32 hit points to start with, and the hit took her down to 14. Good grief. It would be embarrassing to be killed in the tutorial. Her own tutorial. She raised the bow and took aim at the crow. She only had a few arrows, so every shot had to count. The bowstring twanged in her ear and the arrow flew true. The crow's health meter dropped and the bird fell into the corn. She aimed again just under the still visible health bar and it fell to 0 HP. A burst of sparkles appeared where the crow had been. Plus 45 XP.
Nice shot.
In the time it had taken her to fell one crow, he'd waded into the field and cut down the other 3 with his sword. She watched them burst away in a different color than hers had. Plus 10 XP, plus 8 XP, plus 11 XP. Well, if he was higher level, he'd gradually get less experience than her for killing the same mobs. She wished he'd left more for her, though.
Is that all of them?
She asked.
1 second.
Dante marched further into the field. There was a nest on the ground in a hollow right next to a cheery scarecrow. He pulled a flint from his inventory. As with the sword, it just appeared like a magic trick. Then he struck it against his blade once. A spark fell from his hands. The nest caught fire all at once, curls of black smoke rising toward the perfect sky. Then the notification appeared in Dante's color, not Tandy's. Plus 500 XP bonus. Did he just steal her tutorial experience? Wait, she said. Zin the Seer appeared. Oh, well done, hero. Now go tell Farmer Poke that thou hast completed the job. A sound came from outside the game, a loud bang, then another. A burst of light leaked in through the edge of Tandy's VR gig. I have to go, she said. I think something's... Alternus tipped on its side, distorted, and vanished. Pain ripped through Tandy's head, something pulling her hair, or someone. A black insectoid face filled her vision. What do we have here? A low, male voice asked. Tandy screamed, then realized that what she was seeing was part of a helmet. That didn't make her feel any less like screaming. Pipe down, you're under arrest. The man zip-tied her hands behind her back and held her in place while a team in all-black tactical armor swiftly took apart her game rig. They carted it out of her apartment along with her phone, her stack of notes, and the entirety of her tech graveyard, a collection of gear too old to use and too broken to sell. Then they set about destroying her life. They ripped open her pillows and mattress, dumped her canisters of rice and sugar onto the floor, pulled her collection of postcards from the walls, and shoved them into a plastic bag. It all happened so quickly, she could barely comprehend it, like an action movie with too many quick cuts. What's going on? Bewildered outrage cracked her voice. The man flipped his visor open and stared her down. You're Tandy Kahananui. You're under arrest for espionage and conspiracy against the United States. Four. The next hours passed in a blur. Later, Tandy would only remember disjointed pieces of it. She was shoved into a car with windows tinted too dark to see out of. Then onto a plane with no windows at all. She hadn't even known there was such a thing. The shock and the dull vibration of air travel lulled her into something like a trance for a while, though her heart was thumping much too fast. None of her keepers stayed in sight during the flight. They were kind enough to let her into the toilet when she asked, but they didn't unbind her hands. She did her business in a cramped enclosure, and then unexpectedly she threw up, a full-body heave as she tried to reject what was happening to her. It left her weak. She leaned against the sink and stared at her shocked reflection, the dark hollows under her eyes, the paleness of her lips. What's going on? she whispered. A fist pounded on the door, and she shivered.
Hurry up in there, a voice boomed.
I'm almost done. She washed her face and her hands and tried to rinse out her mouth before exiting the lavatory. Her captors secured her into her seat again. She wasn't sure how long they traveled in the end. It was still dark when the plane landed, and she couldn't make out the unlit terrain as they hustled her into a jeep. Eventually, the vehicle entered a tunnel. It never came out the other side. Instead, she was escorted into a cavernous room like an aircraft hangar, and then marched through a maze of windowless concrete hallways all exactly alike. They stopped her in a nondescript door. One of her captors opened it.
Stay put until we're ready to talk to you, he commanded.
Tandy walked into the room of her own volition, before they could shove her. The door closed behind her with a horrifying finality, and she heard the lock click into place. She had been confined in what was obviously an interrogation room. 2 chairs faced each other across a small table, washed in a single cone of dreary fluorescent light from a fixture directly above. There was no one-way glass or other visible means of observation, but Tandy didn't need to see any cameras or microphones to be sure they were there, recording everything she did from every imaginable angle. She sank into the seat facing the door, and she waited. Time passed, but Tandy felt like it had left her behind somewhere. There were no windows and the lighting never changed. The room was so thoroughly soundproofed that the pounding of her pulse thundered in her ears. After a while, an HVAC system cycled on, and a burst of cold struck her neck. Tandy shifted in her chair, arms curled around her knees, and wondered if she'd been fired yet for not showing up to work. Eventually, the door opened. A woman walked in wearing a sober navy suit. Her hair was cropped short, and her already dark face had even darker smudges around the eyes. She held a tablet in her hand and she frowned at it, then at Tandy, then at the tablet again.
You're Tandy Kahananui, the woman said. I must say, you don't seem like the spying type to me. Who are you working for?
Spying type? If Tandy weren't scared out of her mind, she would have laughed. Instead, she squeaked out, I work for industrial informatics. The woman rolled her eyes.
Let's be honest with each other.
I am being honest. The woman pursed her lips.
We caught you red-handed, Miss Kahananui. There's no getting past it. So just be straight with me. How did you wind up in the game?
The game? This is about the game? Tandy tried to explain in halting phrases about the data cap, the logs she'd followed, the simple fact that someone had stolen her game for reasons she couldn't possibly guess at. She took a deep breath. Can someone tell me what's going on? Who are you? The woman threw her tablet on the table and finally sat. I'm Dimple Ranhua, and I'm the Chief of Security for the United States Foreign Conflict Resolution Task Force. Tandy soaked that in. It was a lofty title, the sort of person she'd never have imagined meeting in her real life. Okay, but why are you interested in me?
As I've said, we caught you red-handed, Miss Kahananui. You were accessing a very, very secure system in violation of and at tremendous risk to national security.
You mean the game? Alternus? Dimple leaned forward on her hands so her eyes were level with Tandy's.
Where did you hear that name?
I made it up, Tandy said, bewildered. She started to wonder if this was some sort of particularly vivid nightmare or a fever hallucination. Dimple barked once by way of laughter. Of course you did. I don't know what any of this has to do with national security, she said, but I was just trying to figure out why something was using up all my bandwidth. The game I got into, it's a dupe of the game I've been building for the last 10 years.
That's a ridiculous story. It's not a story. It's just the truth. Do you have any proof? You can look at my game. You can look at the logs. Tandy reached toward Dimple across the table, but stopped short of touching her. You guys took all my stuff. I can give you my passwords. Just look and you'll see. I promise. Dimple stared her down, and Tandy felt like a little fish hiding in the coral while a shark passed overhead. Either you're a world-class actor with the brains of a can of seltzer, or you're telling me the truth. I'm not making it up, Tandy said, her lips trembling. We'll check into it. Dimple looked at her for another moment, then turned on her sensible, chunky heel and left. There was no bed in the interrogation room. Tandy rested her face on her arms to block out the oppressive light and tried to nap. She could have sworn it hadn't worked, but eventually she lifted her head and discovered a tray on the other side of the table. It held a large bottle of water and a protein bar. The bar tasted like a chocolate-scented candle, but Tandy was hungry enough to eat it in 4 big bites. She took a swig of water, too, but thought better of having any more than that. There wasn't a toilet in the room, and she'd have to be a whole lot more dehydrated before she'd risk drinking enough to require a desperation pee in the corner, even if she weren't being recorded by invisible cameras. Eventually, Dimple came back. She paced in front of Tandy's table, both hands folded behind her back. It seems you were right, she said. This is all a terrible misunderstanding. Tandy laughed so hard her knees gave out and she slid down until her butt wasn't on the chair anymore. Tears of relief dripped off her chin and slid down her neck. Dimple took a small multi-tool and clipped off the zip tie holding Tandy's wrists together. Oh, thank God, Tandy said, rubbing the red marks the plastic had left. So I'm free to go. Dimple didn't say yes. We're really sorry for the confusion, Miss Kahananui, Dimple said. I apologize for any damage we've done to your home, and of course we'll compensate you for your losses, but... She looked troubled. What is it? We're hoping that you're willing to serve your country, Miss Kahananui. Something about the way she kept repeating Tandy's name was getting under her skin. Wasn't that a tactic smarmy salespeople use to get you to trust them? Tandy decided to go for broke. What is that game where you found me? I don't understand anything that's happened since those people came and kidnapped me. Dimple sat heavily in the other chair and looked into the corner where Tandy presumed there was a camera watching. I suppose there's no harm in telling you, she said, since we're actively trying to get you on board. She sighed. I want you to think back to a year ago, what things were like on a global stage. It was an easy job. If anything, Tandy wished she could forget. Every day there was news of a fresh horror. A few of the worst highlights sprang to mind. A wing of automated bombers had destroyed every village in a 150-mile radius in rural Pakistan. Entire neighborhoods in New York, D.C., Baltimore, and Houston had burned in the wake of food riots. Japan had become a nuclear state, and then Mexico, and then Egypt. The great leaders of the world were caught up in their own rhetoric against one another, intoxicated with it, and it had seemed like they were careening inevitably toward the end of all things. And then, somehow, the world had kept turning another day and another, and the talk cooled, and the bombers landed, and the price of a loaf of bread had become more reasonable. Everything was awful, Tandy said. And then for some reason, the reason is because of the game. The wiser heads of the world got together and realized that if things kept going as they were, we were going to blast our planet into a lifeless blob of glass. But they couldn't just agree to everything all the time, so we devised an alternate method of conflict resolution. Tandy finally put the pieces together, as impossible as it seemed. With a video game? Her voice cracked. I know, it sounds ludicrous, Dimple said. But with the survival of the world at stake, we made it work. So you're using my game for World peace? Tandy blinked. Now she knew she was having some kind of mental breakdown. Something like that. We've signed a treaty to end automated warfare and take our disputes into a virtual world. And many of the resources we were fighting over, water, oil, rare earths, are being distributed based on leaderboard rankings. The world's most powerful economic and military powers each get a team of 4 players. And they're all abiding by the results. So far, anyway. And the leaders of the world picked my game for this. Dimple looked troubled. Not exactly. It's supposed to be procedurally generated, but the algorithm gathered its own seed data. And I've heard our operations team say they don't understand a damn thing the game does. Look, the truth is, we don't know much about the content of the live game. It's true VR, and the game world is completely real to our players. We can take something like screenshots from our team's brain activity, but we can't know more without pulling them out. And if we pull them out, they're going to lose time and experience, so we don't. Okay. But what we do know is that the pieces we've seen look exactly like your game. You saw it for yourself, didn't you? Even the name, Alternus. Our experts think your game was part of the seed data fed into the machine to learn from. Your host has been breached a dozen times, so your game code is easily available all over the dark web. That would explain everything. The way the game was hers and not in the strange ways in which it differed. The Honey Whisperer skill, the Raspberry Mage specialization, procedurally generated from a hacked seed. Dimple was still speaking. Miss Kahananui, we think that if you went into the game as one of the players, that would give us a meaningful edge. Tandy snapped back to attention. What? You want me to play? Why? The thing is, America has been losing. Not badly, but consistently. We can see the leaderboard, and each day we get a little lower down. We think the edge we need is your special insight into the game, as the designer. Or a designer. She scrubbed at her head as if she could wash away her stress and frustration. The clock is ticking, so we need to decide quickly. Are you in? Tandy pressed her knuckles to her lips. This was being presented to her as a choice, but she got the distinct impression that there wasn't a true way out. But no, she blurted out anyway. No, I couldn't. Reasons to say no flooded her brain. The pressure would be too much, the stakes too high. She'd crack like a raw egg. I couldn't. You wouldn't want me. It would be just like playing any video game, Dimple coaxed her. We've got a comprehensive dossier on you, and we're sure you'd do a great job. We'd pay you our usual consulting fee, of course. You'd find it's quite generous, almost 5 times what you make at Industrial Informatics. No, Tandy said. Dimple leaned back and crossed her arms. She looked at a spot somewhere above Tandy's right ear. You know that we can't let you continue to develop Alternus, even if you don't join the team, she murmured. She added a carrot after the stick. Don't you want the chance to live in your game world and see its potential? She asked, to see it as if it were all real. Tandy hadn't realized before now that her game wasn't hers anymore and couldn't be, that the work of a decade was lost to her. They had everything, and it would be a simple matter to wipe her accounts, shred her notes, and then Tandy would be left with nothing. Or she could see Alternus the way she'd always imagined it, vivid and alive. She could step into her own imagination, at least for a while, and pursue her dream just a little further. She'd been right to begin with. It wasn't really her choice. Tandy braced her spine to sit up as tall as she could. Tell me what I have to do. Five. Each immersion tank was easily the size of a truck, and for a brief, hysterical moment, Tandy tried to picture fitting one into her home. It would take up more than half of the whole place.
They were miracles of engineering that allowed the body to move freely to avoid muscle atrophy. The fluid inside was constantly cleansed and recirculated. Nutrients came in by IV, oxygen by mask, and sensory data was fed directly into the brain through electromagnetic stimulation. It was like nothing Tandy had seen before, more intense than even the highest-end VR rigs on the market. These were built for total immersion over weeks and months of gameplay. Once Tandy went in, she'd be in for a long time. The 4 tanks squatted in a row, a labeled glass pane on the side of each one. She passed the windows and caught brief glimpses of the people inside, the people who would be her new teammates. Dante, of course, no surname needed. Corporal Benjamin Kim, a decorated drone pilot who could be a little gruff, Dimple had warned. He was playing an elemental mage. Etta Adisa, the team leader, a diplomat with a knack for tricky negotiations, playing as a divine seeker, a cleric subtype. And finally, Captain Gregory Dudek, wolf assassin. He was the one Tandy was meant to replace. Dimple murmured orders to the team of technicians watching over the players. "Initiating wake-up protocol," a tech said. "Rise and shine, Greg." There was a ka-chunk, like a car running into a brick wall from somewhere beneath them. The cement floor shook from it. One of the tanks tipped forward to stand upright. The fluid inside drained away rapidly, and then the hatch swung open. A grizzled man emerged, dripping the remains of the goo. He was clad only in an electronic crown and the trailing tubes and wires from sensors and an IV line cascading from his elbow. Tandy looked away, embarrassed for both of them, though the man didn't seem to mind the lack of privacy. A swarm of technicians settled on him, removing the VR gear and finally settling a scratchy olive-drab blanket on his shoulders. "What is it?" he said. "What's going on?" Oh, of course. He didn't know what had happened outside of the game, and the scenarios he was likely to invent all involved unimaginable catastrophe. Peace was a fragile thing. He searched out Dimple, who shook her head with something approaching a reassuring smile. "It's not a disaster," she said. "It's an opportunity." She waved toward Tandy. "We've found an asset we're going to use to leverage the game. She's going inside in your place." Greg looked Tandy over, scratching at a half-inch of beard growth. "Then what are you waiting for?" he barked. "Don't waste any more time." The technicians hovered around Tandy. "Are you ready?" Dimple asked her. Tandy nodded with as much certainty as she could muster. This was her last chance to say no. She knew that would be the sensible thing to do, the safest, most Tandiest thing to do. Go back into her quiet, unremarkable life, give up Alternus forever, or ready. The techs were as efficient as the pit crew of a Formula One event, and Tandy hardly had time to notice all the things they were doing to her as they happened all at once. Clothes off, IV on, face mask on, electrodes and finger clips on, and then she was fitted with Greg's massive heavy crown. She took 3 steps up into the tank and turned to face outward. They sealed the door, and the goo flooded in. She expected it to be cold, but it was warm, like the world's most perfect bath. She spared a moment's panic for whether the face mask would hold when the goo reached her face, but before it could get there, the world dissolved around her, and there she was somewhere else, back in Alternus. Tandy was used to the dozens of ways that VR was good enough but not really real. No headphones could completely erase the sound of her neighbors screaming at each other. No haptic gloves could erase the pull of gravity or the press of her chair against her body. And of course, the lingering aroma of her dinner stayed with her, lending a curry-infused ambiance to the dankest dungeons and the most magical crystal forests. Now she knew perfectly well she was floating in a tube of goo with a respirator and an IV to keep her fed. But she couldn't feel it in the slightest bit. This tech was unbelievably good. So she was finally in Alternus for real. For real, for real.
A breeze ruffled the branches of the trees around her. She crouched down and touched the earth. It was damp and smelled like rain. When she pressed her fingers into it, they left indentations in the loam, and a little dirt stayed under her fingernails. Wow. Wow. She laughed out loud. It was just like she'd imagined it could be. No, better than she ever imagined. There was an argument going on not far away, but she couldn't make out the words. She wondered where it was coming from, and her heads-up display appeared in the air in front of her, with 3 glowing dots on a mini-map. Right. There was still a game interface. She wasn't wearing haptic gloves like she was used to. Or maybe the whole tank was a haptic bodysuit, technically. But she flicked her fingers up, and the rest of the game interface appeared just the way she'd made them. It was a new, strange dissonance to see the floating panels and info boxes lying over a world that she could touch. A world that she could smell. She checked over her profile to see what she was working with. Against all expectation, the game had retained the data from her experience with Dante in the tutorial. Her character selection, skills, and even a small amount of experience she'd gained. Still, if she'd known she'd be stuck with this setup indefinitely, she might have taken a little more time and care in her decisions. Oh well, time to step up and serve her country. The 3 dots on the mini-map were tagged as being the rest of her party. She walked toward them, past a glade of conifers with fireflies dancing between them, around a lily-filled pond and into a wide open meadow. The 3 were huddled around a campfire, gesticulating at one another with increasing urgency. Dante was one of them, still in the rusty breastplate he'd been wearing during the tutorial quest. She identified the other 2 from her brief glimpse into the tanks. Benjamin Kim turned out to be a man in black mage robes with phoenix eyes and a dusting of freckles across his broad nose. Despite his choice of class, he had a muscular build and buzz cut of a more physically inclined military man. He stood at Tandy's approach and, "Who goes there?" he said, as if that were an actual thing actual people said in real life. Well, they weren't in real life anymore. They were in Alternus, so why not? Points for committed role-playing, she thought. The 3rd member of the party was Etta, an elegant black woman wearing a loose-fitting orange caftan and pants. She had a round body, but thin cheeks with deep smile lines and beautifully arched eyebrows. She must have found the avatar customization setting that Tandy was missing, because her hair was an improbable whirl of lavender cotton candy, rising in a smooth sweep to a point a foot higher than her head. "Hi," Tandy said. "I'm Tandy, but I guess you can see that from my tag. I guess I'm in your party now. Go Team USA." They all looked at her, shocked into silence. Guess nobody else had been paying attention to their mini-map.
"It's her," Dante said. "This is the player I met before."
Ben walked into Tandy's personal space and loomed over her.
"What did you do with Greg?"
He snarled.
"Bring him back."
"I'm his replacement." Tandy's voice was meek. She regretted not being more emphatic immediately because he moved closer and growled.
"What the hell kind of trick is this?"
Etta swept between them and then pulled Ben a few steps away from Tandy.
"What do you mean, his replacement?"
Tandy held her hands out. "It's complicated," she said, "but Dimple told me I was going to swap out for him. Look, we're all on the same team now, right?" Her interface said United States under her name. She hoped like burning that it displayed the same thing when they looked at her. Dante had the unfocused look he got when he was working in a game interface. His fingertips twitched slightly and his lips moved soundlessly. He was using a subvocal microphone to dictate text messages, like she'd seen on dozens of Let's Play videos. Tandy guessed he was putting up arguments and analyses, much like Ben's, but he was using private chat to do it because he was more respectful of her feelings, or perhaps because he was not an idiot. But Ben wasn't shy about airing his thoughts out loud.
Why would Greg be replaced? Is he alive? He seemed fine until he vanished.
Etta held up a soothing hand. Dimple told you. You mean Dimple Ranhua? Yes. Ben strangled something imaginarily in midair.
She's gotta be up to something. Dimple would never hamstring us by putting in someone we've never trained with, who's already 4 levels behind. Why you?
Dante demanded. Tandy looked at him, his brows drawn together like she was a piece of trash he'd found in his breakfast. She tried to say, "Because I made Alternus," but she choked and the words wouldn't come out. The things he'd said earlier haunted her. Shitty game, stupid scripts. How could she admit that they were hers? "I don't know," Tandy whispered. "I'm sorry."
Then how do we know you're not just making this up?
Ben asked. "I wouldn't make it up," Tandy said. "And how do you suppose I could even get in here if I wasn't supposed to be?" There was a moment of silence as the rest of her new team reflected on this excellent point. Etta rubbed just under her ear.
This is a real surprise, so forgive us if we're having a bit of trouble adjusting.
Tandy twisted her shoulders. "Of course. I know this must be a terrible surprise, losing someone you were used to working with, but I promise I'll work as hard as I can to make it up to you."
"Damn straight you will,"
Ben muttered. Tandy looked between them, then back at Dante, and couldn't decide who seemed more surly. "Do you need a minute to discuss things privately?" Tandy ventured. "I can give you a little space. I don't mind."
"That would be very thoughtful of you,"
Etta said. "Okay." Tandy moved a distance away, returning to the lily pond. Crickets were singing, and a slow romantic string piece stretched across the landscape. It wasn't her music, but Tandy found herself admitting that it was a lot better than the free shareware music she'd been working with. There was more to take her breath away everywhere she turned. Twilight was dying in an excess of pinks and golds. Tandy admired it with shining eyes. Then she turned and saw the moon slowly sailing higher at the other end of the sky. A full moon. She rushed back to the campfire. "Listen," she said. "We really need to get to someplace with walls." Dante snorted out loud this time.
Noob just gets here and she thinks she should be the one calling the shots?
No. Of course not, Tandy said. It's just that it's getting dark and the moon is full, so that means... A low moan echoed across the meadow. The earth began to heave below their feet. Then clods of dirt turned over, revealing crawling tangles of maggots. A skeletal hand reached out, grasping for purchase, then another. Skeletons emerged from the ground, one by one, wielding rusted swords and axes and wearing horned helmets atop their indecent grins.
"Ah, shit,"
Ben said. And then, as one, the dead began to attack.
You're listening to Ctrl-Alt-Destroy, starring Summer Glau. Produced by Realm, your portal to another world. Realm. Listen away. Ctrl-Alt-Destroy is written by Andrea Phillips, Maurice Broaddus, Jacqueline Koyanagi, and E.C. Myers. Executive produced by Molly Barton and Julian Yap. Audio production, sound design, editing, and theme music by Amanda Rose Smith.